The boarding pass scanner released a sharp beep that cut through the air, pulling dozens of confused eyes toward it. "There is an issue with your ticket," the gate agent said, her voice suddenly louder than necessary, freezing the entire waiting area for a heartbeat. And in that brief moment, Chris Lawson understood with painful clarity the familiar storm was starting again. The atmosphere in the first-class lounge at Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson Airport grew heavy. Not because of the weather, but because of the invisible weight of suspicion. The kind of weight he had felt his entire life. It made no sound. It echoed in the eyes of the people staring at him, as if he had been caught doing something wrong. Chris stood, tall expression, neutral. No forced smile, no overreaction. He set his carry-on gently on the floor and looked straight at the gate agent Dahlia Brooks, who was trying and failing to hide her discomfort behind a strained smile. Chris was not someone easily shaken by skepticism, but the way Dahlia avoided meeting his eyes, as if his very presence in a space reserved for the wealthy was odd or inappropriate, tightened something deep in his chest. He said nothing. There was no need to. Around him, whispers rose like a shift in the wind before a downpour. What's going on? Did he go to the wrong gate? First class looks like that now. The murmurs were soft, but to him they were as sharp as cold metal pressed against skin. They did not know who he was. They saw only a black man in a perfectly tailored charcoal grey suit. They did not see the 15 years he spent building Aerosolve from a tiny 40-square-meter apartment. They did not see the hundreds of nights he stayed awake testing logistic AI models. They did not see the 12-digit contract he was on his way to sign in San Francisco, the one that would transform the aviation industry forever. They saw only his skin, and they believed that was enough to judge him. Dahlia repeated herself softer, but colder. "So please step aside." She did not look at him. She looked at her screen, then at the line of white passengers behind him, smiling and boarding them with a tone far gentler than anything she had offered him. Each time their boarding passes scanned beep, 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 it felt like a quiet declaration that this place did not belong to Chris. But what cut deepest was not the discrimination itself. It was how smoothly it happened, how practiced it was, like a routine he and others like him had grown too familiar with. If they knew who he truly was, if they knew the man they were belittling was about to negotiate a $3.2 billion global transport optimization deal, if they knew he held the kind of influence that could send Skywave Airlines' stock price plunging within minutes, would they dare? Of course not. But they did not know, because he did not flaunt it. True power never needed to. And right now, he wanted to see how they treated someone they believed was insignificant. "Excuse me," Chris finally said, his voice low and calm like a lake before a storm. "I received no notice of an issue. I purchased a first-class ticket 3 weeks ago." Dahlia still did not look up. "The system is showing an error. I've called the supervisor." Her face attempted professionalism, but her eyes gave away something else. Bias. Not overt malice, but the quiet, automatic kind, the kind people never admit they have. Behind him, an older man with silver hair and a gold watch let out a mocking laugh. "Probably the wrong gate. He does not look first class to me." The woman beside him added, "These days everyone thinks they deserve first class." Chris heard every word, but his expression remained steady, almost unnervingly composed. Because he knew one truth: every storm has an eye. And he was standing in it. Then a condescending voice cut in. Is there a problem here? The supervisor arrived, Derek Collins, a middle-aged man with neatly combed thinning hair. He gave Chris what people in the industry called the screening look, a head-to-toe scan, searching for justification for his suspicion. Your ticket is not valid for first class, Derek declared, voice heavy like a verdict. The system shows you booked economy. Chris opened his app, displaying the words, first class confirmed. The email, the receipt, everything perfect except the way they were treating him. Derek glanced at the screen, then smirked slightly. These things are easy to edit, he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. A cold chill ran down Chris's spine. This was no longer doubt. This was accusation. A passenger behind him groaned impatiently. Can we board? Let him deal with it on his own. A younger man added quietly, but with obvious contempt. He's fishing for a free upgrade. Chris's faint smile vanished. For a brief second, only a few noticed the shift in his eyes. The kind of shift that warned people never to push a man to the edge of his restraint. Derek sighed dramatically, as if granting mercy. To avoid delaying the flight, we will allow you to board, but you will sit in economy. We'll resolve this later. Chris stared directly into Derek's eyes. You are telling me I must sit in a seat I did not purchase, so someone else can sit in the seat I paid for. Derek looked away, as if the truth itself made him uncomfortable. We have no other choice. Are you boarding or not? The question hit like a slap. Chris inhaled slowly. He did not want to cause a scene, not because he was afraid, but because he knew silence could be sharper than any outburst. Fine, he said, his voice eerily even. I'll board. Good, Derek replied quickly, handing him the economy boarding pass, as if eager to remove him from sight. But as Chris stepped into the jetway, what he saw next ignited something volcanic inside him. When he passed through the first-class cabin, his seat, 2A, was empty. Completely empty. A small card was slotted into the headrest with the name Lawson C. No one was seated there. No one had been reassigned. No system error. Just lies. A blonde flight attendant, Melissa, hurried over and stepped between him and the seat, as if blocking evidence. Sir, this is not your section. Please continue forward, she said, her tone soft but cutting like a blade. In that instant, Chris understood they did not just want to deny him. They wanted to hide what they had done. They believed he would accept it quietly. Their biggest mistake was assuming he was like everyone else. Chris pulled out his phone, opened the camera, hit record. He did not speak. He did not rage. He simply documented everything. The empty seat, the name card, Melissa's stiff posture, the avoiding eyes of the first-class passengers who looked at him as if he had invaded forbidden territory. He knew he did not need to shout for the world to hear. He needed only the truth. In the middle seat of economy, squeezed between two men who made no effort to give him space, Chris stayed silent. But in that silence, a storm was forming, not one that would destroy him, but one that would destroy those who believed they had the right to humiliate him. They had no idea the man they forced into a cramped seat held AI technology capable of revolutionizing global transport, that he was headed to present one of the largest deals in aviation history, that with a single well-timed video, he could cost Skywave Airlines hundreds of millions of dollars. They didn't know, but they would. The plane lifted off, gently shaking. Chris leaned back and closed his eyes, but his mind wouldn't rest. Every whisper, every glance from Dahlia, every dismissive comment from Derek, every frame of the video on his phone, They spun in his mind like pieces of a puzzle. This was not the first time, but it would be the last. Outside the window, the afternoon sun stretched across the wing in a long golden streak, and inside the cabin, a man forced into a small economy seat was about to change the skies of America forever. For nearly 5 hours, the plane shot westward, like a silver arrow slicing through the clouds, while Chris Lawson remained trapped in a suffocating reality he knew far too well. The two men beside him, one snoring softly and the other claiming both armrests as if they were his birthright, barely acknowledged Chris's existence. Physical discomfort was nothing compared to the storm running wild in his thoughts. They did not just circle around what happened at the aircraft door, they dug deeper into the system that had been producing moments like that his entire life. Memories rose like undertows. When he was 22, standing outside a conference room at a tech firm in Chicago, where he was the top candidate, an employee walked by, glanced at him, and asked, "Are you delivering food?" When he was 30, after signing his first 6-figure contract, he went to celebrate at a high-end restaurant. The hostess looked him up and down and seated him next to the restroom without a word. When he was 35, viewing houses in a suburb of Cleveland, the agent showed him only rundown properties despite his clear budget. "You will feel more comfortable in this area," she had said with a smile, as if doing him a favor. But the most painful parts were never the blatant acts. They were the small moments, the microaggressions, the ones people excused with you probably misunderstood. Chris Lawson didn't misunderstand. He understood perfectly. He pulled out his phone and replayed the video he had recorded. The LED lights in the first-class cabin reflected off the name card Lawson C on the empty seat. That seat was a living piece of evidence, a silent accusation Skywave tried to bury beneath polite excuses. Chris zoomed in on the frame. Clear, irrefutable. Even the rhythm of his breathing in the background was steady, cold, and focused. He was not the kind of man who posted online for attention. For years, he believed true power came from capability, not noise. But today, every principle he held was being weighed against the truth, and the truth was too heavy to stay silent. The announcement from the flight attendant pulled him back to the present. "We will be landing in San Francisco in about 25 minutes. The sound cracked open a new chapter in his mind. He needed to prepare for tomorrow's meeting, the one that could bring Aerosolve a multi-billion-dollar contract he had spent 7 years pursuing. But instead of reviewing his slides, he stared at the cramped space between the seats where his laptop should have been open. If he were not squeezed so tightly, he could barely breathe. He opened his email. A message from Professor Leonard Brooks, sent the day before, appeared on the screen. "Remember, Chris, change does not come when you ask for permission. It comes when you demand accountability." The words tapped softly on the door of his controlled anger. He was not upset about being belittled, he was used to that. He was upset because his first instinct had almost been the same as always endure, swallow it, move on. But today, something was different. Maybe it was the empty seat. Maybe it was Derek Collins saying these things can be edited. Maybe it was the way the first-class passengers had looked at him as if he did not belong in their world. Or maybe it was because, after so many years of tolerance, he had no room left inside him for another ounce of quiet acceptance. Chris set his phone down. Only for a moment, he picked it back up. This time he opened his browser and began searching information about Skywave Airlines. A vague idea began forming in his mind, but vague in the most dangerous way it was taking shape. And that shape was not the irritation of a wronged passenger. It was the beginning of a plan. Articles appeared on the screen. Skywave settles discrimination lawsuit confidentially. Former employees allege biased treatment of minority passengers. Civil rights group demands FAA review Skywave protocols. Each headline poured fuel on the rising flame inside him. The reports spanned years. Quiet settlements, complaints brushed aside, posts from mistreated passengers ignored. A pattern emerged, undeniable and deliberate. This was not an incident. This was a system. The plane began its descent, the fuselage trembling slightly. But the real tremor came from the man in seat 34B. The plane landed. He waited for the back rows to exit first, then quietly grabbed his carry-on and walked out. As he stepped into the terminal, a wave of cool air hit his face, sharpening every sense. He was not tired. The anger had transformed into something else, something sharper. Focus. He pulled out his phone and called the one person who understood him well enough not to ask unnecessary questions. "Jordan, it's me." On the other end was Jordan Pierce, Aerosolv's 37-year-old head of legal sharp as a blade. "Chris, you landed your voice. What happened?" Chris told him. No embellishment, no dramatics, just facts. Each detail was captured and processed by Jordan with professional fury and the precision of someone who had taken down corporations twice their size. Jordan did not interrupt. When Chris finished, there was silence for 3 seconds. Then Jordan spoke. "We are going after them, and not like some passenger suing over bad service." "The way you are thinking," Chris smiled faintly. "You know what I am thinking. I have known you 10 years. I know that tone. You are about to start a storm." Chris's second call was to Amelia Vaughan, former chief operating officer of a major airline, and now an aviation logistics consultant. A brilliant woman whose career had once been halted by an invisible ceiling. When she heard the story, she stayed silent for a long moment. Then she said, "If you are going through with this, I am with you. Not just for you. For everyone who has been treated that way." Chris thanked her quietly. No need for long explanations. People who had lived through discrimination rarely needed reasons spelled out. Chris walked to the baggage carousel, but did not pick up his luggage. He stood among the crowd staring at his phone again. He opened the front-facing camera. The warm airport lights reflected in his eyes calm on the surface, but with a rising tide beneath. He pressed record. "Today I experienced something that thousands of Black Americans have experienced," he said, his voice steady and sharp as glass. "And I am not letting this become just another bad memory. I am turning it into the beginning of change." He stopped the recording, saved it, but did not post it. Not because of hesitation, but because timing was everything. By the time he reached his hotel, it was 11 at night in Atlanta. But his mind had never been clearer. The executive suite was so quiet, the hum of the air conditioner sounded like distant wind. Chris set his suitcase down, loosened his tie, and sat at the desk. He opened his laptop. He did not go to his slides for the big presentation. He opened a new file. He typed, "Operation Airlift Draft 1. Then the pieces began falling into place. Legal front, Jordan. Operational insight, Amelia. Public transparency tool. Industry-wide pressure. Acquisition strategy. Board leverage. Algorithmic reform." He stopped at the last line. Looked at it. Smiled for the first time that day. Everything connected in a way only someone like him could see. Chris Lawson was not just a victim of discrimination. He was the one person with the technology vision resources and network to not only react, but dismantle the problem at its roots. Around 2 a.m, an email arrived from Skywave. "We apologize for the inconvenience system error. Complimentary 500 miles. Chris read it once. Not angry. He laughed. A quiet, meaningful laugh. 500 miles to buy the silence of a man like him. A man who could wipe $500 million from Skywave's value in 2 weeks if he chose to. Whoever sent that email had no idea who they were dealing with. The only person who knew was Chris. And he was about to let the world know too. He placed his phone on the stand, tilted his head, and watched the video he had recorded earlier. In the dim hotel light, the image of him standing before the empty seat, 2A, glowed like a warning. They thought he was just another passenger being pushed down. The truth was, they pushed down the wrong man. And that mistake was about to end Skywave Airlines, as they knew it. He hit the post button. The screen flashed. The storm began. The video went live at 2:17 a.m. Atlanta time, a moment of the night when most people still awake tend to fall into 3 categories: the insomniacs, the desperate, or the ones about to change the world. Chris Lawson belonged to the last group. He did not add long captions. Only 1 sentence. First class while black. Then came the 3-minute video. No yelling. No arguments. Just the truth, recorded from a perspective so calm, it was unsettling, an empty seat bearing the name of the man who had been denied it, and a system working silently to hide the discrimination. At first, the video had only a handful of views. A small alert buzzed lightly on the wooden hotel desk from time to time, but 12 minutes later, the pace picked up. 1 view, 14, 60, 200, 1,000. 7 minutes after that, a sudden explosion, 21,000, then 50,000. The algorithm had sensed something. Chris stood before the window looking down at the quiet streets of San Francisco. The streetlights blurred like strokes of yellow paint on the pavement. But he did not see the calm of a sleeping city. He saw something else, a war that had just begun. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Brooklyn, Tanya McGill, a young civil rights attorney, curled up on her sofa with a cup of hot cocoa, mindlessly scrolling through videos before bed. She clicked on Chris's clip. 30 seconds later, her eyes widened. "Why is the seat still empty?" she whispered, leaning closer. "How is it empty?" She watched again. Then again. Her fingers trembled slightly with the familiar outrage she had seen in hundreds of cases. 1 minute later, she shared the clip on her page with the caption, "If you think discrimination in aviation is over, watch this." The shares multiplied quickly. In Chicago, 70-year-old Professor Leonard Brooks was reviewing book drafts when he received a notification from a former student. When he tapped the video, his gentle expression slowly hardened. He had taught Chris back when the young man lived on instant noodles. He knew that look in Chris's eyes, the look of someone who had reached the limit. "He has finally chosen to fight," he murmured. In Los Angeles, an influencer with over 8 million followers played the video during a live stream. His reaction was only 2 words. "Holy, watch this." From there, the clip spread like wildfire. Early the next morning, as sunlight slipped through the hotel curtains, Chris woke to a cascade of relentless notification sounds. His phone vibrated steadily on the table. He picked it up. Views 4.8 million. Shares 312,000. The hashtag first class, while black ranked #1 nationwide. Major news outlets began reporting. CEO wrongfully downgraded from first class sparks outrage. Viral video accuses Skywave Airlines of discriminatory behavior. American aviation once again exposed for systemic bias. Chris exhaled deeply, not from pride or excitement, but because he knew things would get worse before they got better. His phone chimed again. A message from Jordan Pierce. The video is blowing up the media. Get ready, Chris. Skywave is about to make even more mistakes. And we need every one of them. Chris did not smile, but his eyes sharpened. At the same time, more than 2,000 kilometers away, at Skywave Airlines headquarters in Charlotte, North Carolina, the PR department had descended into chaos. On a massive screen in the corner, Chris's video looped over and over. Every time the clip reached the empty seat, the entire room froze. Lisa Hammond, the interim PR director, stood in the middle of the conference room, pale as chalk. She clenched her jaw. The video has over 5 million views. We have less than 2 hours before reporters crowd our gates. A trembling team member stammered, Should we issue a public apology right now? Lisa slammed the table. No, not without direction from the CEO. At that moment, the conference room door burst open. CEO Richard Helston strode in, face exhausted, but tone dripping with arrogance. Just another passenger looking for attention. We release a system error statement. That's enough, Lisa protested. But sir, the video clearly, Richard cut her off. I said system error. No personal apology. No admission. Lisa stared at him, as if he were blind in the middle of a hurricane. You do not understand, Richard. This is not a minor incident. This is I said do it. He barked. The room fell silent. What Richard did not know was that elsewhere in the building, in the boardroom, messages were flying between key board members. This video will tank the company's valuation. We cannot let Holston handle this the old way. If the stock falls too far, we must intervene. Richard severely underestimated the danger. The board did not. In San Francisco, Chris adjusted his vest, checked his tie, and prepared to leave for his meeting with Jordan and Amelia. But before stepping out, he paused and looked into the mirror. The reflection was not tired. It was calm, with the controlled determination of a man who would not take a single step backward. He knocked on the hotel meeting room door. Jordan was already seated, laptop open gaze, sharp as steel. Chris I compiled every discrimination case in the industry from the past 10 years. If Skywave wants to play legal games, we have enough ammunition to blow up the entire sector. Amelia looked at Chris, her voice softer, but deeper. Your video just played on Good Morning America. 3 other airlines texted me. They want to switch to Aerosolve's AI system, but they want to know if you plan on going to war with Skywave. Chris sat down. We are not going to war, he said. Jordan raised a brow. We're not. Chris stayed silent for 3 seconds. Then he gave the coldest smile since the beginning of this story. We are reforming. Jordan laughed. Knew it. Chris turned towards the window where morning light shimmered across San Francisco's buildings. Skywave chose the wrong man to treat like trash. They do not know who I am. They do not know what technology I control. They do not know how easily I can bring them to their knees. He looked at his 2 allies, but starting today they will. Jordan snapped his laptop shut like a punctuation mark. What is step 1? Chris inhaled slowly. Let them step into their own trap first. They will. And exactly as he predicted, 10 minutes later, an email appeared on his phone. We apologize for the inconvenience. System error. Complimentary 500 miles. Jordan looked at the email and burst into a contemptuous laugh. Perfect. Exactly what we needed. Amelia shook her head. They truly have no idea who they messed with. Chris's voice dropped low like thunder before a storm. Time to show them. At Skywave headquarters, Richard Halston stood before the glass wall of the conference room, staring at the market ticker. Skywave stock was plunging 4% in 15 minutes. His assistant rushed in, breathless. Mr. Halston, Chris Lawson is not just a random passenger. Halston frowned. So the assistant swallowed hard. He is the CEO of Aerosolve Technologies, the company providing AI systems for major transport conglomerates. He has enormous influence. The words froze Richard Halston where he stood. His earlier arrogance vanished instantly. You are saying Lawson, is that Lawson? The assistant nodded. One sentence forced Halston into his chair. We downgraded the wrong man, sir. Richard felt his chest hollow out, and he knew what was coming next. Not an angry passenger, but a Category 5 storm aimed directly at him. That afternoon, Chris posted a second video. An apology is not 500 miles. An apology begins with transparency. The video hit 2 million views in 3 hours. Skywave scrambled to hold an emergency press conference, repeating familiar phrases, system error. Misunderstanding. We value every passenger. But the public was no longer naive. And Chris knew it. Jordan texted time to release Step 2. Chris answered, not yet. Let them sink deeper. That afternoon, the San Francisco sky carried a strange shade of gray. Thick streaks of cloud stretched across the horizon, like lines carved with charcoal, reflecting against the meeting room window where Chris Lawson sat. He was not looking at the city's beauty. He was seeing something else, the outline of a battlefield, forming minute by minute. The laptop screen before him displayed a flood of breaking news, each headline cutting deeper into Skywave Airline's reputation. Skywave faces nationwide outrage. Civil rights attorneys call for federal investigation. Discrimination video reaches 12 million views. But what made Chris press his lips together was not the dramatic headlines. It was a message from Gideon Aerosolve's data specialist. Chris, we analyzed thousands of passenger posts, hundreds of similar incidents with Skywave in the past 10 years. Chris shifted his gaze toward Jordan, who was sipping coffee while scrolling through emails. We are not looking at a mistake anymore. This is systemic, he said. Jordan nodded, his voice sharp as steel. And the beautiful thing is they are still denying everything like a child caught with stolen candy. What we need now is for them to speak more. Chris narrowed his eyes. He will speak, he replied. Men like Halston are always convinced they cannot be wrong. Amelia Vaughan walked in, holding a latte, her expression tense, but her eyes burning with the fire only those abandoned by the system ever carried. I checked their internal chatter. Skywave is issuing an official statement tomorrow. Want to guess what they will claim? Chris did not answer. He did not need to. Amelia smirked. System error. Jordan burst out laughing. Perfect. Exactly what we want. Chris looked at his two allies, feeling as though they were not just working together, but preparing to enter a trench so deep none of them knew who they would become on the other side. But Chris knew one thing he would not lose. He had already lost enough in his lifetime. In Charlotte, North Carolina, at Skywave headquarters, an emergency meeting had been called. The room was thick with tension, dense enough to slice through. All screens replayed Chris's video especially the close-up of the empty seat, 2A the clip that rendered Skywave's entire PR strategy useless. CEO Richard Holston stood at the head of the table, hands clasped tightly, as if trying to hide the tremor beneath his aging skin. This is being blown out of proportion. All we need is to reassure the public and confirm this was a technical glitch. The Chief Legal Officer, Morgan Tate 58, adjusted his glasses. Richard, it is not just the video. Former employees are flooding social media with accusations. We are being accused of having an unofficial policy toward minority passengers, Richard growled rumors. Bitter ex-staff. A voice rose from the end of the table. It was not loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. It is no longer rumor. This is a crisis. Everyone turned. Eleanor Holston, 74. Granddaughter of Skywave's founder, rarely attended major meetings. But when she did, the entire game changed. Her white hair was pulled back neatly, her deep blue eyes holding the weight and experience of a lifetime in aviation. Eleanor placed her tablet on the table. On it was the public data analysis Aerosolve had released, dozens of posts, hundreds of lawsuits, thousands of comments, all showing the same behavioral pattern. They are calling this a system error. Her voice dropped low like the thud of a steel door closing. No, this is culture. Richard shrank back, forcing his voice to stay firm. It is just a temporary media flare. Eleanor stared at him, her gaze sharp enough to make the once untouchable man swallow hard. Richard, do you truly believe going head-to-head with Chris Lawson, the man redefining global transportation with AI, is a temporary issue? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The others exchanged looks, their fear shifting into something new. Recognition. Skywave had underestimated the wrong man. Morgan Tate sighed. We need to talk to Lawson directly. Richard slammed the table. No. If we give in, he will own us. Eleanor let out a soft, cold laugh. Do you really think you still have a choice? Silence swallowed the room. Back in San Francisco, Jordan received a message from a contact inside Skywave, a former law school colleague. It contained only 2 lines. The board is fracturing. Halston has lost support. If you push harder, he will fall. Jordan showed Chris. Chris looked at the screen for a few seconds, then slowly nodded. Time for the next step. Amelia tapped the table lightly. Is it time to announce Operation Airlift? Chris placed his palm flat against the surface, thinking carefully. He was not in a rush. Wise men never strike while their opponent is panicking, because panic often delivers a heavier blow than any attack. But he understood that the storm needed the right direction. Finally, he said, tomorrow. Jordan raised a brow. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. Skywave will deny everything publicly, and the moment they lie to the entire country, we release the truth. Jordan laughed loudly. Now you are thinking like a CEO. Chris answered with a quiet smile, the kind that people who once belittled him should have feared. The next morning, Skywave held their press conference. Richard Holston stood at the podium, a forced smile stretched across his face. Cameras, microphones, and recorders aimed at him like hundreds of hunting eyes. Skywave Airlines has always prioritized respect for our customers, Richard began in a voice thick with PR polish. The incident involving Mr. Lawson was a simple technical error. In the press row, a journalist whispered, "He has no clue who he is up against." Richard continued, "We do not discriminate based on race or background. Claims circulating online are inaccurate." The moment his last sentence hit the air, Jordan published Chris's second video online. This is the truth behind Skywave's technical error. The 1-minute clip compared the empty 2A seat that Skywave denied and dozens of similar reports from other passengers. In 38 seconds, the views hit 100,000. In 4 minutes, 2 million. In 29 minutes, an explosion. 14 million views. Some reporters received notifications on their phones. Hands shot up. Voices cracked. "Mr. Holston, are you aware Lawson's new video contradicts everything you just stated?" Richard froze. Eleanor, watching the live stream from the boardroom, closed her eyes. She knew at that exact second Richard was finished. In San Francisco, Chris watched the view counter spike like a rising flood. Jordan whistled. Amelia exhaled quietly, as if releasing a weight she had carried for years. Chris stepped toward the window, watching the sunlight pour over the bay. "Time to begin part 2, he said. Jordan asked part 2 of Operation Airlift. Chris shook his head, his eyes glowing with the fire only survivors of adversity carry. "No. Part 2 of the truth." News exploded like a media nuclear blast. In a single morning, Chris Lawson's comparison video shattered every layer of defense Skywave Airlines had spent years building. 2 hours after CEO Richard Holston's disastrous press conference, the stock market opened and Skywave immediately went into freefall. At 10 hours, 12 minutes in the morning, the stock dropped 8%. At 10 hours, 38 minutes, it dropped 12%. At 11 hours, 4 minutes, 17%. By 11 hours, 29 minutes, with rumors spreading through the market like a tsunami, that Skywave could face federal investigation, the number plunged to 23%. In the large boardroom on the 38th floor of Skywave headquarters, the air felt like a block of ice weighing 1,000 pounds. Every board member stared at the blazing red chart in front of them. Only one man seemed unable to grasp the gravity of the collapse: Richard Holston. He tried to keep his voice calm, though the twitching at the corners of his eyes betrayed the panic under his skin. "This is temporary panic. We just need..." "Do you still not understand?" Eleanor Holston cut in her voice so sharp the entire room froze. "No one believes you anymore. Not the public, not the press, not the shareholders, and certainly not us." Richard snapped around, face flushing red. "Eleanor, are you trying to destroy me in front of everyone?" Eleanor shrugged slow and controlled the gesture of someone who had seen many CEOs rise and fall. "No, Richard, you destroyed yourself." Phones rang relentlessly. Partners were cancelling contracts. Major investors demanded emergency calls. One board member, Charles Donnelly, pale and shaken, looked at Richard and whispered, "We cannot continue like this." But Richard clung to denial like a man gripping a burning iron. As soon as Richardson and Company released their support statement, "The stock will..." A bitter voice cut him off. Richardson and Company just withdrew their $5 million investment. All eyes turned toward the speaker, Morgan Tate, head of legal, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. "Impossible," Richard muttered as if his world had just collapsed. Morgan placed a stack of documents on the table, his voice dropping into a grave tone. "Not only that. 3 civil rights organizations are preparing to request a full FAA investigation into Skywave, and Chris Lawson just filed a copyright claim for something called Operation Airlift." The entire room turned toward Morgan, as if he had summoned a storm with those words. "What is Operation Airlift?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. Morgan did not answer immediately. He looked at Eleanor as if waiting for permission. Eleanor nodded. Morgan opened the internal news feed. In the center of the page was a short message, accompanied by the Aerosolve logo. Operation Airlift, an initiative to reform the aviation industry using transparent AI systems to eliminate bias, monitor fairness in service, and ensure equitable seat allocation. A board member gasped. This is what the aviation industry has failed to accomplish for decades. Eleanor spoke each word with the weight of a declaration of war, and Lawson is about to make it the new standard. He was not just discriminated against. He is preparing to transform the entire industry. No one disagreed. Finally, Charles Donnelly, usually the one to avoid conflict, inhaled deeply and said the words no one had dared voice earlier. We need to discuss removing the CEO. Richard shot up like he had been electrocuted. You want to fire me over a video from some random passenger? Eleanor looked him straight in the eyes, cold enough to freeze the room. Do you still not get it? Richard Lawson is not random. He is feared across the transportation sector. He is sought after by investors. He has data technology and political influence, and he is far smarter than you. Silence swallowed the table. Richard opened his mouth to fight back, but a staffer burst into the room, face drained of color. Mr. Halston, the media is at the gate. They want to know why the company deleted 16 whistleblower videos in the past 10 minutes. The entire board turned to stare at Richard. Eleanor spoke quietly, her tone freezing the blood of everyone who heard it. Deleting videos, you just signed your own burial papers. While Skywave drowned in chaos, Chris Lawson was completely calm. He sat in a quiet cafe on Market Street in San Francisco. Sunlight reflected off the glass windows, but Chris remained focused on the columns of data before him. Jordan and Amelia sat across from him. Neither spoke. Not from tension, but because they sensed they were witnessing something larger than themselves. Chris tapped his finger lightly on the table. The time is ripe, he said. Jordan replied instantly. Airlift. Chris nodded. Amelia tilted her head, her voice low. Are you sure once you announce airlift, every major airline will be forced to confront you? There is no turning back. Chris looked outside where a plane cut across the distant sky. Real change never comes from fear, he said. And I am not here to fix Skywave's mistake. I am here to fix the entire aviation industry. Jordan stared at him for a long moment, as if measuring whether his friend understood the magnitude of what he was about to do, something that could carve his name into history or bury his career forever. Finally, Jordan smiled. Then let's announce it. Chris rose. His steps carried the weight and sharpness of metal. Prepare the press conference. I want every major media outlet present. Amelia opened her laptop. What do you want the opening message to be? Chris inhaled deeply, then spoke the words that shifted the entire mission into irreversible territory. No one can reform a system from the outside. To change it, you have to step inside. Jordan frowned. You mean Chris turned around, his gaze icy calm but burning with the fire of a man who had prepared his whole life for this moment. I will buy Skywave Airlines. Jordan nearly choked. You what? Not the entire company, Chris continued. I will buy enough shares to become the largest shareholder, to gain the right to demand internal review, to gain the right to replace the CEO, and to force Skywave to become the first airline in the world to implement transparent, bias-free AI. Amelia leaned back, stunned. Chris, that is, yes, he cut in. It is the only way to end discrimination in aviation. I am not just suing them. I am going to own them. The room fell silent. Silent enough to hear the steady ticking of the wall clock. No one dared say more. They knew this moment was not just a business strategy. It was the beginning of a reconstruction of the American skies. Chris Lawson, the man belittled at the aircraft gate less than 48 hours earlier, was preparing to turn that humiliation into the opportunity to reset an entire industry. Jordan was the first to break the silence. "Chris, if you do this, you will no longer be just the CEO of Aerosolve. You will become a force." Chris smiled lightly. "I do not want power." He glanced out the window where small planes moved like silver dots across the sky. "I want justice." At Skywave headquarters, the final seconds of the board meeting were taut as tightened wire. Eleanor rose, planting both hands on the table like a commander on the battlefield. "I call for a vote of confidence regarding the CEO," she declared. Richard leapt to his feet. "Eleanor, you have no right." "Silence," she said coldly. The vote took 45 seconds. The result, 8 out of 11 votes, demanded removal. Richard Halston, the man who once believed he was untouchable, was stripped of his position on the very day the video went viral, and the news spread like wildfire. Skywave CEO ousted amid discrimination scandal. In San Francisco, Chris read the update on his phone. At the same moment, Jordan received an internal email from an anonymous source. "The board is ready to meet you. If you become the largest shareholder, they will listen." Chris Lawson smiled softly. Not a smile of victory. A smile of someone who understood the greatest chapter had yet to begin. That morning, the San Francisco sky carried a silver-gray hue like a theater curtain moments before the lights rise. But inside the Grand Horizon Hotel's vast ballroom, the air was hotter than a congressional hearing. Every camera, every lens, every microphone pointed toward the podium, like electronic eyes, waiting for the moment a new chapter of history would be written. Reporters packed shoulder to shoulder. Flash after flash burst like lightning announcing a coming storm. Everyone waited for the man who had shaken the entire American aviation industry with nothing more than a phone and a 3-minute video. Backstage, Chris Lawson stood tall in a perfectly fitted dark grey suit. He barely moved, but in his eyes, Jordan and Amelia could see something unmistakable, a dangerous stillness. The kind of quiet found in a time bomb seconds before detonation. "Are you sure?" Jordan asked, his voice low. "Once you make today's announcement, there is no stepping back." Chris stared toward the stage where the white backdrop with the Aerosolve logo and the words "press conference" was being adjusted under the lights. "After what I've been through, you think I still want to step back?" Amelia scrolled through documents on her tablet. "The entire industry will fight you. The airlines, the lobbyists, the power brokers inside the FAA. Chris nodded slightly. "Good. When the system pushes back, it means you are striking its weakest point." Jordan let out a small laugh. "All right, Captain. Let's go to rewrite the sky." A technician peeked in. "Mr. Lawson, 3 minutes until we begin." Chris drew a long breath, not to calm himself, but to center his focus. He knew that once he walked through those doors, he would no longer just be a CEO. He would become the face of reform. The doors opened. Brilliant white light from the ballroom washed over him like a stage spotlight, hitting a performer at the exact moment destiny calls. Chris stepped out. The entire room went silent. A strange, heavy quiet rolled across hundreds of people. Then, as if triggered by the same signal, all cameras began firing at once, shutters crackling like a hailstorm on glass. Chris stepped behind the podium and placed both hands on the wooden edge. The lights illuminated every sharp angle of his face, strong, resolute, commanding respect. He began. "Ladies and gentlemen, 3 days ago I was just a passenger on a Skywave Airlines flight." His voice was not loud, but it was clear, clean, and strong enough to echo through the entire room. That day I was denied the seat I paid for. I was told to step aside. I was downgraded to an economy seat, while the seat with my name on it remained empty. A soft murmur rose among the reporters, but Chris pushed forward, giving no space for interruption. But the problem was not the seat. It was how I was seen, how I was judged, how I was deemed unworthy. He paused for a single beat, just long enough for the entire room to hold its breath. "Not the first time, but this will be the last." A low wave of shock rippled across the press row. Several reporters leaned forward, readying their keyboards. Chris continued, gaze locking onto the livestream camera, as if addressing the entire nation. "In the past 3 days, I have reviewed hundreds of stories from passengers who experienced the same thing, but never had a platform to speak. They stayed silent. They accepted it. They believed they could not change the system." He leaned slightly closer. They were wrong. The room erupted in a storm of noise, whispers, frantic typing shutters snapping faster. Heat rose in the air as Chris delivered the next blow. "Today I am not here to talk about the disrespect I faced 3 days ago." His eyes sharpened, like a blade honed to perfection. "Today I am here to announce Operation Airlift." The room exploded. Jordan, watching from the wings, felt goosebumps rise along his arms. Amelia froze, knowing this moment, this exact second, would be written in aviation history. Reporters shouted questions, hands shot into the air, but Chris kept speaking, his voice slicing through the chaos. "Operation Airlift is not a protest. It is a comprehensive plan to change the operational structure of the aviation industry." The screen behind him lit up with 4 words: accountability, transparency, equity, reform. Chris continued, "Airlift has 4 pillars. First, full transparency in seat allocation and upgrades through neutral AI. Second, real-time monitoring of discriminatory behavior. Third, limiting subjective authority in customer service decisions. Fourth, establishing a complaint channel that reports directly to the board instead of customer service." Reporters typed furiously, capturing every word like military orders. Then Chris lowered his voice and delivered the line that froze the room. "But that alone is not enough. If you want to change a system, you must have power inside that system." The room leaned forward, as if pulled by gravity. "Therefore, I am announcing that Jordan held his breath." Amelia gripped the edge of the table tightly. "In the past 2 days, my investment group has secretly acquired 11.4% of Skywave Airlines stock." A silent explosion burst across the room. People stared at each other. Mouths dropped. A reporter dropped her pen. Others stood up instinctively. Some covered their mouths as if witnessing something forbidden. Chris continued, voice terrifyingly calm. "I am now the largest shareholder of Skywave." A storm of gasps filled the ballroom. Cameras zoomed in on his face. The number of live stream viewers shot past 2.4 million within seconds. "As the largest shareholder, I will call for a special board meeting to evaluate corporate culture, operational protocols, and leadership accountability for a decade of discriminatory incidents." The lights reflected in his eyes like a cold strip of steel. "We will clean the system from the inside out." But Chris was not finished. No, he had one more strike, the kind Jordan knew would shock the industry more than the original video ever could. And finally, Chris said slowly, "I have filed a petition with the FAA and the Department of Transportation to create an interagency commission on anti-bias standards in aviation. Aerosolve has developed a new algorithm capable of measuring fairness in service based on real data." He punctuated each word. No airline will be able to hide discrimination again. He ended his speech with a slow, resonant tone, like a drumbeat echoing across a stadium. "I am not doing this for myself. I am doing this for my mother, who was randomly searched for years. For my brother, who was asked if he could afford his priority seat. For those who were not believed when they said they were discriminated against." He placed both hands on the podium and bowed his head slightly. "The skies belong to all of us. It is time the system understood that." One breath of absolute silence. Then the room erupted. Thunderous applause shook the walls. Cameras flashed violently. Reporters shouted over one another. "Mr. Lawson, do you truly intend to take control of Skywave? Are you declaring war? Is this the biggest reform in aviation history?" Chris stepped away from the podium without answering. He did not need to. Every answer was already inside his speech. Outside the ballroom in the long carpeted hallway, Jordan exhaled hard, like a man who had just jumped out of a plane without a parachute. He looked at Chris. "You actually did it." Chris smiled faintly. "More than that." Amelia stared at him, her eyes filled with a rare kind of respect. "Chris, do you realize, starting today you do not just represent yourself anymore?" Chris turned toward her. "You represent everyone who has ever been pushed out of first class." Amelia finished in a tone like an oath. "This time you are the one opening the door." Meanwhile in Charlotte, when Richard Halston watched the live stream up to the part where Chris announced ownership of 11.4% of Skywave, he dropped his glass onto the floor. A board member beside him stared, voice unsteady. "Richard Lawson does not want an apology. He wants your seat." Cold dread crawled up Richard's spine. A sharp, elderly voice cut through the room. Eleanor Halston stepped into the boardroom, leaning on her ebony cane, her gaze so cold it froze the air. "No." She said each word, falling like stone onto the floor. "Chris Lawson does not want anyone's seat." She stared directly at Richard, and for the first time he felt true fear in her eyes. He wants the future of Skywave. That morning in Charlotte carried a pale, cold light, as if the sky itself sensed that Skywave Airlines would not leave this day unchanged. Outside the headquarters, a long line of reporters waited, microphones raised like a forest of antennas, ready to transmit the slightest sound. The glass door slid open, and a gust of cold air swept into the lobby, followed by the confident yet steady footsteps of Chris Lawson. He wore a black linen suit, a crisp white shirt, and a midnight blue tie. No unnecessary accessories, no attempt to impress. But something in the way he walked made even the security guards men, who rarely noticed anyone, straighten instinctively. Jordan and Amelia flanked him like the wings of a battle formation, but only Chris kept a face carved from stone. Not angry, not anxious, just still. A stillness so intense it was almost frightening. The receptionist rose to her feet the moment she saw him. Her voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Lawson, the board is waiting on the 42nd floor." Good Chris replied, his tone perfectly level. The three stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. The mirror reflected Chris's face. Deep eyes, steady cold but bright. Jordan glanced over, smirking. You know you look like someone who is about to blow up an entire system. Chris did not turn. Because I am. The elevator chimed. The doors opened onto the 42nd floor. The hallway was long and wide, covered by deep blue carpet, and lined with vintage photographs of Skywaves history, including the airline's first flight using a small silver biplane. Chris scanned the images briefly. Ironic. Aviation always boasted about progress, freedom, and the sky for everyone. Yet on the ground, inside this very system, thousands of passengers were still treated like second-class citizens, simply because they did not fit someone's idea of what first class should look like. The corridor led to a pair of large wooden doors. 2 security staff stood on either side, nodding to confirm his identity. Jordan whispered, "Do not be surprised if they try to make this difficult." Chris answered with a look. They picked the wrong person to challenge. The doors opened. The Skywave boardroom was a circle of power, an oval ebony table, a massive LED screen, and a portrait of the founder, Charles Halston Eleanor's great-grandfather, hanging proudly on the wall. At the head of the table sat Richard Halston, his face so tense it had turned red. Beside him were 10 board members, people who had steered the airline for decades. Some faces cold, some defensive, some angry. Only one face remained calm, Eleanor's. She looked at Chris as though he were the piece she had been waiting for over half a century. Chris entered with no haste, but with absolute certainty, as if he were the one running this meeting. And in the eyes of half the board, he already was. Richard scrambled to his feet, trying to appear in control. "Mr. Lawson, we deeply regret," Chris lifted a hand. Just a gesture, but sharper than any interruption. The room fell silent. "I am not here to hear your apology," Chris said, his voice smooth like steel against glass. "I am here to fix what you broke." The coldness in his words made several board members straighten instinctively. Richard sank back into his seat, trying to hide the panic etched onto his face, but his hands trembled as they locked together. Eleanor spoke her voice, carrying the kind of authority that never needed to raise itself. "Mr. Lawson, on behalf of the board, thank you for coming. We want to hear your proposal." Chris set down a leather portfolio, opened it, and withdrew thick navy-bound documents. He placed one before each board member. No one dared touch theirs until he allowed it. "What you are holding," Chris said, "is the most comprehensive report ever compiled on bias in airline customer service." One board member, Grantley, a notoriously conservative figure, frowned. "Mr. Lawson, we do not believe Chris stared directly at him. You do not believe because you haven't read the data. Data does not discriminate, Mr. Grantley." "People do." Grantley swallowed hard. The entire room shifted their attention fully onto Chris. He continued, voice steady, but heavy enough to tilt the balance of an entire system. "In this report are more than 3,200 cases of eligible black passengers, denied upgrades, 1,850 cases of repeated random searches, and 2,400 cases of disrespectful treatment by Skywave staff." He paused, letting the weight of the numbers sink in. And 47 of those resulted in confidential settlements. A murmur spread across the room. Morgan Tate, head of legal, lowered his gaze, knowing every number was true and knowing they had been buried for too long. Chris went on. "But the worst part isn't the numbers. It is the culture behind them." He pressed a button. The LED screen lit up. Videos from former employees appeared. Testimonies, internal emails, recordings from private briefings. "Keep first class clean. Let loyalty customers decide who belongs there. Handle sensitive cases discreetly. Board members turned pale. Richard burst out, "This is edited." "You are." "These came from Skywave's own internal database," Chris said flatly. "And I am not the only one who has them." Richard froze. Eleanor leaned back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed slightly. She looked at Chris not with admiration for his strength, but for his precision. She understood the difference. Chris switched slides. A graph of yesterday's stock collapse filled the screen, plunging like a vertical cliff. "I am not here to point out failures," he said. "I am here to propose solutions." The board's breathing tightened. Eleanor nodded gently. "Please continue." Chris revealed the next slide. Airlift reform proposal. Phase 1, rebuild service culture. Phase 2, bias-free AI for all customer-related decisions. Phase 3, transparency protocols across the entire system. Phase 4, independent oversight committee. Phase 5, retraining all Skywave personnel. Phase 6, senior leadership restructuring. The last phrase, senior leadership, made every eye shift toward Richard. His face drained of color. "What do you want?" Richard choked out. Chris answered with one word: accountability. The room shook in total silence. Richard shot to his feet. "No, you're an outsider." Chris stepped forward. His gaze pierced Richard like an icicle through the ribs. "I am the largest shareholder of this airline. I am not an outsider. I have more authority than you right now." The sentence sliced through the last of Richard's illusions of power. Eleanor spoke her voice, the final hammer, closing the coffin of an old era. "I call for a vote on the airlift proposal," Richard shouted, slipping into desperation. "Eleanor, you cannot," but no one was listening to him anymore. Hands lifted, 7, 8, 9, and finally Eleanor's 10th. Everyone knew what that meant. The result was 10-1. Airlift passed. Richard's breath hitched. He looked from one board member to the next, hoping someone would change their vote. No one did. Eleanor rose, leaning gently on her cane. She faced the CEO who once believed himself untouchable. "Richard Halston," she said slowly and clearly, "as of this moment you are suspended from your position as CEO of Skywave Airlines. Effective immediately. For failed leadership, lack of transparency, and severe damage inflicted on the company." Richard collapsed into his chair like a felled tree. Chris did not smile. He simply walked out of the boardroom. Amelia and Jordan followed. Behind him, Eleanor called out, "Mr. Lawson." Chris turned, her eyes softened by the slightest degree. "Welcome to Skywave." The hallway was as silent as a cathedral. Jordan looked at Chris with a mixture of shock and awe. You didn't just win," he said. "You flipped the entire table." Chris replied, "The table was rotten long before I touched it. I just happened to be the one who pressed down." At the end of the hallway, the glass doors opened and sunlight poured in, illuminating Chris's face. That morning in Charlotte carried a pale and icy light, as if the sky itself understood that today would be the day Skywave Airlines would never be the same again. Outside the headquarters, rows of reporters stood waiting, microphones rising like a forest of antennas, ready to broadcast any whisper. The glass doors slid open, and a cold gust swept into the lobby, followed by the steady, confident footsteps of Chris Lawson. He wore a black linen suit, a crisp white shirt, and a midnight blue tie. No excessive accessories, no flashy details, but the way he walked made even the security guards, who rarely noticed anyone, straighten instinctively. Jordan and Amelia walked beside him like the wings of a formation entering battle, but only Chris carried a face carved from stone. Not anger, not nervousness, just stillness. A stillness so piercing it was frightening. The receptionist rose the moment she saw him, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Lawson, the board is waiting on the 42nd floor." Good Chris replied, his tone flat and steady. The three entered the elevator. When the doors closed, the mirror reflected Chris's deep eyes, steady and bright cold, but aware. Jordan glanced at him and smirked. "You know you look like a man who's about to blow up an entire system." Chris didn't turn. "Because I am." The elevator chimed. The doors opened. The 42nd floor's hallway stretched long and wide, with deep blue carpet, its walls lined with historical skywave photos, including the airline's first flight, using a small silver biplane. Chris glanced at them. Ironic. Aviation loved to boast about progress, freedom and the sky for everyone. Yet here on the ground, inside this very system, thousands of passengers were still treated as second-class citizens, simply because they did not fit someone's idea of what first class should look like. The hall ended at a pair of heavy wooden doors. Security checked their identities. Jordan whispered, "Don't be surprised if they try to push back," Chris answered with a look. They chose the wrong man to push. The doors opened. The Skywave boardroom was arranged like a circle of power, an oval ebony table, a massive LED screen, and the portrait of founder Charles Helston on the wall. At the head of the table sat Richard Halston, his face flushed with tension. Alongside him were 10 board members, some cold, some defensive, some quietly furious. Only one appeared calm, Eleanor. She looked at Chris as if he was the piece she had been waiting decades to see appear. Chris walked in with no haste, but with complete certainty, as though he were the one presiding over the meeting. And in the eyes of half the board, he already was. Richard staggered to his feet, trying to maintain control. "Mr. Lawson, we deeply regret," Chris lifted his hand. A single gesture silenced the entire room. "I am not here to hear your apology," Chris said, his voice smooth and sharp like steel. "I am here to correct what you have broken." The coldness in his tone made several board members straighten involuntarily. Richard dropped back into his chair, trying to hide the tremor running through his hands. Eleanor spoke her voice, holding authority without effort. "Mr. Lawson, thank you for coming. We would like to hear your proposal." Chris placed a leather case on the table, opened it, and handed thick, blue-bound reports to each board member. None dared touch theirs until he finished speaking. "What you are holding," Chris said, "is the most complete report ever compiled on systemic bias in airline service." One board member Grantley frowned. "Mr. Lawson?" I don't think Chris looked straight at him. "You don't think because you haven't read the data?" "Data does not discriminate, Mr. Grantley. People do." Grantley swallowed hard. Chris continued, his voice steady but heavy as stone. "In this report are more than 3,200 cases of eligible black passengers, denied upgrades, 1,850 cases of repeated so-called random searches, and 2,400 cases of disrespect from Skywave staff." He paused, and 47 of those ended in private settlements. A low wave of shock rippled across the table. Morgan Tate, head of legal, stared down at the surface. He knew the numbers were real. He knew how long they had been hidden. Chris said, "But the worst part is not the numbers. It is the culture behind them." He pressed a button. The LED screen lit up with leaked videos and emails from former employees, internal instructions to keep first class clean, to let loyal passengers signal who belongs, and to handle sensitive cases with discretion. The board turned pale. Richard yelled, "This is edited. You are." This came from Skywave's own internal database, Chris cut in, "and I am not the only one who has it." Richard froze in place. Eleanor reclined, her eyes narrowed. She respected not just Chris's strength, but his accuracy. Chris pressed another button. A chart showing yesterday's stock plunge filled the screen. "I am not here to identify failures," he said. "I am here to propose a solution." The room tightened like a held breath. Eleanor nodded. "Please continue." Chris revealed the airlift reform slide. Phase 1, internal cultural audit. Phase 2, bias-free AI for all service and upgrade decisions. Phase 3, system-wide transparency protocols. Phase 4, independent oversight board. Phase 5, full retraining of Skywave staff. Phase 6, restructuring senior leadership. At the last phrase, senior leadership, all eyes moved to Richard. He went pale. "What do you want?" Richard choked out. Chris answered with one word: accountability. Silence detonated through the room. Richard stood violently. "No, you cannot. You are an outsider." Chris stepped forward, voice cold as ice. "I am the largest shareholder of this airline. I am not an outsider. I have more authority than you do right now." That sentence shattered the last illusion of Richard's power. Eleanor said, her tone, the final blow of a closing era. "I call for a vote on the airlift proposal." Richard screamed, "Eleanor, you cannot." But no one heard him any more. Hands rose. 7, 8, 9, and Eleanor's 10th. The result was 10-1. Airlift was approved. Richard's breath faltered. He looked around, hoping someone would change their vote. No one did. Eleanor stood leaning on her cane, facing the man who once believed himself untouchable. "Richard Holston," she said, slow and clear. "As of this moment, you are suspended from your position as CEO of Skywave Airlines, effective immediately, for failed leadership, lack of transparency, and severe damage to the company." Richard collapsed into his chair like a fallen tree. Chris did not smile. He simply left the room. Amelia and Jordan followed. Eleanor called after him, "Mr. Lawson." Chris turned. Her eyes softened for a moment. "Welcome to Skywave." The hallway was silent as a cathedral. Jordan stared at Chris with awe. You didn't just win," he whispered. "You flipped the whole table." Chris replied, "The table was rotten. I simply touched it." The glass doors at the end of the hallway opened, and sunlight washed across Chris's face. Outside, news of Richard's suspension spread faster than a jet breaking through the stratosphere. Within an hour, every major outlet reported Skywave leadership overturned. Passenger once denied first class now controls the airline. Chris Lawson, from victim of bias to architect of aviation reform. In front of the building, cameras lined up. Signs reading, "We stand with Lawson End." Bias in the skies and fair flight for all filled the street. Some Skywave employees hid among the crowd, half curious and half frightened. Inside, the tension felt like a violin string stretched to the breaking point. Richard remained in the boardroom, head bowed, shoulders trembling. 30 years of reputation collapsed in 30 minutes. Worse, he finally realized the truth. No one pitied him. They only pitied themselves for not removing him sooner. Meanwhile, Chris walked toward the executive offices as if he had known them for years. The employees he passed told a different story. They knew exactly who he was. Not just the man discriminated against. not just the tech CEO, but the new one in power. A young employee dropped a stack of files upon seeing him. Someone else pressed themselves against the wall as if Chris were a storm that had just opened the door. But what caught Chris's attention was not fear. It was the tired, hopeful look in the eyes of employees who had suffered under the old culture for years and had been waiting for someone strong enough to change it. At the end of the hall, an older woman stopped and bowed her head. "I have worked here 27 years, she said softly. "No one has ever dared stand up like you." "Thank you." Chris nodded, not surprised. It was the nod of someone who knew the fight would be long, but at last, people were walking with him. Jordan leaned in. "Chris, you've become a symbol." Chris answered quietly, cold but heavy with purpose. "I don't want to be a symbol. I want real change." Amelia raised her tablet. "Real change starts in that office. But they are not going to like it." Not going to like it was an understatement. The moment Chris stepped into Skywave's executive operations floor, all eyes turned to him. Some nodded politely. Some looked away. Some froze. But one stood confidently, Janet Monroe, the chief operating officer, long known as Richard's right hand. She eyed Chris sharply. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her tone polite but cold, "congratulations. But I hope you understand something. Skywave is not a tech startup. Aviation culture cannot change in one day." Chris met her eyes. "I do not plan to change it in one day. I plan to change it in the time required." Janet lifted her chin. "And do you think Skywave employees will accept AI monitoring their behavior?" Chris answered immediately. "If they do not discriminate, there is nothing for AI to monitor." The whole room fell silent. Some executives who had enjoyed unchecked authority swallowed hard. Janet narrowed her eyes. "You do not understand our processes. You have no experience running an airline." Chris answered without hesitation. "You are right. And you do not understand the technology I built. Technology used by transport conglomerates, logistics giants, even the Department of Transportation. If you think I do not understand this system, you are mistaken." Janet paused. She finally realized the man standing before her didn't come to negotiate. He came to rebuild. Amelia stepped forward, voice firm and sharp. "I spent 22 years in this industry, and I was pushed out because I didn't fit the traditional leadership image. So if anyone here intends to fight airlift, understand that the one who will lose is not Mr. Lawson. It is Skywave." Janet stiffened. A quiet, suffocating tension began to fill the room. Chris turned to the digital display and activated the airlift roadmap. Phase 1 internal culture audit. Phase 2 revised service priority structure. Phase 3 deployment of the fare route algorithm. Phase 4 full staff retraining. Phase 5 rebuilding transparent upgrade procedures. Phase 6 creation of an independent oversight division reporting directly to the board. As the list appeared, the expressions of several Skywave executives shifted from pale to red to ashen. They understood. Everything they had done, everything they had covered, would be exposed. A senior executive at the end of the table, Harold Dawson, head of human resources, stood up abruptly. "I object. Personnel decisions belong to us. You cannot use machines to judge people." Chris looked at him as if he were an old, crumbling wall. "I am not using machines to judge people," Chris said, voice firm as hardwood. "I am using data to prevent human bias from destroying this company again." Harold reddened. "You have no authority." "I do have authority," Chris said, "because I am the largest shareholder. And because the FAA called me this morning, The room froze. Jordan saw the exact moment panic shot through their faces. Chris continued. The FAA is demanding Skywave disclose all upgrade decisions, VIP handling, seat assignments and complaint responses from the past 6 months. In case you didn't know, Skywave's internal system stored everything. His voice was iron. Everything. Janet stepped back. Harold swallowed. Executives lowered their heads. They were no longer in control. They were being judged. Eleanor appeared at the doorway, leaning on her ebony cane. "I trust everyone understands the situation," she said, her quiet voice crushing the room. Chris looked at her. She nodded. The confirmation was clear. Skywave no longer belonged to the people in the room. They were no longer decision-makers. They were the ones being evaluated. "We begin the internal audit today," Chris said. Harold shouted, "You cannot staff will revolt." Chris stepped closer. His eyes were not angry, but cold enough to make a man reach for a coat. If they revolt because airlift removes their ability to discriminate, then they are revolting because they lost the power to mistreat people. And if that is what they want, they will no longer work at Skywave. A gasp came from Janet. Not because she disagreed, but because she knew Chris was right, ruthless, but right. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice softer but solemn. "Mr. Lawson, there is something you must know." Chris waited. Eleanor reached into her coat and took out a silver USB. Her breath faltered slightly, something almost never seen in her steely demeanor. "For 60 years, she said, Skywave kept a secret archive reports of internal discrimination that leadership never released. It begins in 1964 and continues until 6 months ago." The room froze. Janet whispered, "Secret since the civil rights era." Eleanor nodded. "I don't know how Richard survived knowing this existed, but I do know you cannot reform Skywave without it." She placed the USB in Chris's hand. "Do not let history repeat itself," she said quietly. A charge surged through Chris. Not anger, not fear, responsibility. He looked at the USB the way one would look at the key to a dark empire. Amelia inhaled sharply. Jordan whispered, "My God." Chris tightened his grip on the USB, then a ping on his phone. Not from Jordan, not from Amelia, from an unknown source. One message. "You think Skywave is the only problem? They are just the tip of the iceberg." Chris froze. Another message appeared. "The entire aviation industry is watching you, and not everyone wants you to change the system." Then the final message. "Be careful. Not everyone wants this door to open." In that moment, Chris Lawson understood that Operation Airlift had just entered a new phase. The enemy was no longer one airline. It was every power hiding behind it. That night, the Skywave headquarters was so silent, you could hear the wind slipping through the seams of its glass panels. Employees had gone home, the hallway lights shut off one floor at a time, but in a single office on the 42nd floor, the lights remained on, illuminating the silhouette of a man standing before the window, with a silver USB clenched in his hand. Chris Lawson did not sit. He couldn't. His body was wound tight like steel wire, and his mind moved as fast as a server processing billions of data points a second. Behind him, the large LED screen still displayed the airlift slide from the meeting, but he wasn't looking at it. His eyes were fixed on the distant lights of Charlotte, the tiny glowing points that looked like eyes watching him. He knew. From this moment on, every step would be watched. This was no longer a private fight against Skywave. He had touched something the aviation industry never wanted anyone to touch: the truth. Jordan walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee, but there was none of his usual humor in his expression. "Chris," he said. Setting the cups down, I checked that message again. "The source is untraceable. All identifiers are blocked. That's not something a regular person can send." Chris let out a faint, humorless smile. "Not surprising. They've been watching me since the video went viral." Amelia followed, laptop in hand, a file open on the screen. "If the message is real, then this USB," she glanced at the device in Chris's grip, "isn't just Skywave's dark history. It might be a map to decades of systemic discrimination." Chris nodded slightly, eyes on the USB, as if it contained the blueprint for rewriting the meaning of fairness. "We open it," he said. Jordan shot up from his chair. "Chris, are you sure? If this is what I think it is, if it's the archive from the original Halston, this isn't just data. It's something that could collapse the entire aviation industry." "Then it needs to be opened even more," Chris replied. Amelia ran the USB through a specialized scanner. "No malware, no traps. Whoever gave this to you wants you to see what's inside." Chris plugged the USB into the laptop. The screen went black for a second before a single folder appeared. Folder name, Eros 64, classified. Jordan inhaled sharply. Eros, the old internal code of Skywave. From the 1960s. "God, how long has Eleanor kept this?" Chris opened the folder. Inside were 7 files. Eros 1964. Report Eros 1978. Internal notes. Eros 1989. Confidential Eros 1999. Service bias data. Eros 2008. Upgrade protocol. Eros 2014. Diversity. Memo. Eros 2023. Restricted. He clicked the first file. It opened. Black letters appeared on white background. 1964. Implementation of Premium Cabin Standards Protocol. Purpose preserve experience of high-value passengers. Guidance discreetly discourage non-traditional premium passengers from accessing first class. Jordan cursed under his breath. Then came the examples. Each line made Chris's expression darken. Non-traditional passengers includes individuals who may cause discomfort to core clientele, including ethnic minorities, passengers with lower visual income indicators, passengers unfamiliar with premium etiquette. Chris tightened his grip. This wasn't random discrimination. It wasn't rogue behavior. It was a policy, a system, a directive. Amelia covered her mouth. They called black passengers non-traditional for decades. Jordan said quietly, "And that's how culture passes down. After a while, you don't need to write it. People just know." Chris opened the 1978 file. Internal emails from executives. To retain first-class loyalty staff must exercise flexibility in identifying passengers appropriate or inappropriate for the cabin. How do we define inappropriate left to the professional judgment of frontline staff? Chris slammed the file shut. Professional judgment, a phrase that had pushed countless people out of first class and out of basic dignity. He opened the 1999 file. Charts, graphs, thousands of denied upgrades, thousands of skewed cases. Amelia whispered, "This is the evidence they fear the most." Chris opened the 2023 file. It required a password, and not a Skywave password, a secret key. Chris entered the code Eleanor had given him. The file opened, and what appeared silenced all 3 of them. 48 incidents of discrimination in the past 6 months alone, all handled internally, hidden from the board, hidden from the FAA. There were videos, photos, employee reports, emails. "Keep the cabin quiet. Avoid guests who create visual distraction. Do not allow this passenger into the lounge. Appearance not appropriate. Recommend secondary screening if passenger lacks clear financial indicators." Chris said nothing, but his hand trembled not with fear, but with a fury he was barely containing. Amelia exhaled shakily. "Chris, this isn't just a secret archive. This is a weapon." Jordan sank into a chair. "If this gets out, not just Skywave, half the aviation industry could face federal investigation." Chris stood still, eyes locked on the screen. The words were not just data. They were the bones of a system built for some and against others. He said quietly, voice deep and cold, "They never intended fairness. They only learned how to hide the unfairness better." Amelia looked at him. "You want to release all of it, don't you?" Chris didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window where the night winds bent the streetlights. "Not all of it," he said. "Only what the public needs to know. Enough to break the old system. Not enough to collapse the entire industry and destroy hundreds of thousands of jobs. A balance between justice and responsibility." Jordan nodded slowly. "That's why you're not like Richard. You want reform, not destruction." Chris removed the USB, placed it into a small steel lockbox, sealed it, then locked it inside the office safe. But he kept one encrypted copy tucked away where no one else would find it. At that moment, his phone rang. A strange number. Chris answered. Lawson speaking. The voice on the other end was quiet, sharp, and familiar enough that he recognized it before the second sentence. "Eleanor." "You have seen the USB," she said. Not a question, a statement. Chris braced himself against the desk. "I have. Then you understand why I could never give it to anyone on the board." "I do." There was a pause. Then Eleanor said something that made Chris straighten instantly. "But you are not the only one with that data." Chris tightened his grip on the phone. "What do you mean that USB is only a copy of what Charles Helston, my great-grandfather, collected? He did not archive only Skywave. He archived dozens of airlines." Chris's blood seemed to thicken. He helped design National Aviation Service standards in the 1960s, Eleanor explained, and those standards did not belong to Skywave alone. Chris suddenly understood. The system of bias was not the flaw of one company. It was the legacy of an entire industry. Airlift targeting only Skywave would be like cleaning a single room in a collapsing skyscraper. Eleanor continued, "Chris, I will arrange for you to meet the person who holds the remaining files. Files even I cannot access. Who the National Aviation Standards Oversight Council, a private organization no one knows exists. They hold records the FAA has never released. If you want to change the entire industry, you must confront them." Chris closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, they were sharp as a blade, freshly sharpened. When tomorrow, Eleanor said, "New York, someone will meet you." Chris replied softly but firmly, "I'll be there." He hung up. Jordan and Amelia stared at him, waiting. Chris turned to them, his voice low, but heavy with the weight of a decision that would reshape the future of aviation. "Tomorrow we aren't fighting Skywave anymore." He continued, slower, firmer. "We're fighting history." That night, Chris did not sleep. He sat before the window watching the city lights shimmer. The silver USB sat locked away, but it felt as though it radiated heat, reminding him that the battle ahead was larger than anything he had imagined. In the reflection on the glass, Chris no longer saw the man who had been denied a first-class seat. He saw the man who was about to change how the entire world was treated in the sky. The morning fog lay thick over New York, like a grey veil trying to hide something beneath it, but the lights of the buildings along 6th Avenue still cut through the mist like glowing blades, cold and sharp. At the curb in front of a steel-black skyscraper, an SUV pulled up. The back door opened. Chris Lawson stepped out. He wore a midnight blue suit with a crisp white shirt and a grey tie. Not a single wrinkle. But his eyes, only those who have seen a storm before it forms, would recognize what that gaze meant. A calm so controlled it was terrifying. Jordan and Amelia followed close behind, moving slowly, observing everything. Above them, wind rushed against the glass panels, creating a whispering sound, like secrets being pulled from the shadows. A man in a long coat approached. "Mr. Lawson," he said, voice gravelly but firm. "I'm Daniel Moore. I've been assigned to bring you to the council." Chris looked him in the eye and immediately understood this was no regular security escort. This was someone who had lived too long inside a world where nothing could be spoken aloud. "They are waiting," Daniel said, leading them inside. The building was darker than Chris expected. Not dark because of poor lighting, but dark by design, soft white lights that did not bounce off faces, walls that absorbed reflections. A place built for conversations the world was never meant to hear. "This is the headquarters of the National Aviation Standards Council," Jordan asked quietly, careful not to let his voice echo. Daniel did not turn around. "The public name is the Standards Research Institute. But within the industry, people call us the Sixth Propeller." Amelia frowned. Strange name. "Not strange to anyone who knows the history of aviation," Daniel replied. "A plane engine needs 5 blades to generate thrust. We are the 6th blade, invisible but influential." The door at the end of the hallway opened. A wide chamber awaited them with a high ceiling and a round ebony table at its center. On the walls hung a map of the entire National Aviation Network. Around the table were 11 chairs. 10 of them were occupied. The faces varied, men and women older and younger, across different backgrounds. But their eyes all shared one thing in common, the gaze of people accustomed to making decisions that shape millions of lives. The woman sitting in the center, grey hair, pulled back, features sharp and authoritative, studied Chris for a long moment. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "welcome to the 6th Propeller." Chris did not bow. He simply stood straight, placed the silver USB on the table and said, "I believe you know why I'm here." "We do," said the bearded man to her left. "And we also know you have viewed something that has been kept secret for 6 decades. A younger woman leaned forward. "The question is not what you know. The question is, what do you intend to do with it?" Chris looked around the table, voice steady, unshaken. "I intend to change the entire airline industry. Everything from seating and upgrades to service protocols, training and complaint systems." One member let out a soft laugh, not mocking but astonished. One man intends to change a system bigger than the government itself, no. Chris replied, "Not one man." He looked at them, eyes sharp as a laser cut. "I represent the passengers, the sidelined employees, the new generation that refuses bias, the people who were kept out of first class simply because they did not look like those inside it." The room fell completely silent. The grey-haired woman continued. "Do you know why the Aero 64 archive was never released?" Chris answered without hesitation. "Because you believed the world wasn't ready. Because you feared the industry would collapse. Because you feared an economic crisis." "No," she said. One word. Short and sharp, The whole room turned toward her. She looked directly at Chris, because the people who held those records did not have the courage to change what they exposed. Her voice softened, though not in weakness. "But you do." She slid a thick envelope toward him. "These are the files left by Eleanor Halston's great-grandfather. Not the copy you have, the complete version." Chris opened the envelope. Inside were heavy folders stamped and marked Flight Class Bias, 1964 through 2023, Hidden Passenger Index, Internal Service Ranking System, Priority Passenger Behavior, Playbook Discretionary Bias, Cases Full Archive. Jordan instinctively stepped back. Amelia exhaled sharply, gripping the table. The woman continued. "Now you understand. It was never just Skywave. Not one airline, not one CEO, not one decade. The entire history of aviation in the United States, beginning in 1964, was built on a soft discrimination system, disguised under the polished name of service standards. A system no one dared to touch." She leaned forward, face solemn. "Until you appeared." Chris set the envelope down and looked at each of them. "I am not here to destroy the industry. I am here to rebuild it." Another member asked, "And what if we refuse to let you use these documents for reform?" Chris leaned back, voice light but cold as metal. "Then I will release the USB. Skywave will collapse. Other carriers will fall with it. And all of you will be summoned before Congress to explain why you hid this for 60 years. The room froze. Jordan swallowed. Chris Amelia looked at him, not afraid, but proud. The woman at the center studied him closely. In her eyes was something others might misinterpret as challenge, but Chris recognized it as respect. "You are strong," she said, "not because of the USB, but because you do what others fear." Then she turned to the council. "We vote." No one objected. One by one, hands rose. All of them. She faced Chris again. "Mr. Lawson, the sixth propeller formally endorses Operation Airlift. All Eros files, all suppressed data, all hidden standards will be unlocked. The FAA will be notified. Congress will receive the policy reform package." Chris exhaled slowly. Not relief. Confirmation. The battle had officially entered its next stage. The woman stood. "But there is one more thing you must know. Something important." Chris rose as well. She looked at him deeply, as if seeing through the yaws of his life. "You are not only changing aviation." She stepped back and extended her hand. "We want you to lead the National Ethics and Standards Commission for the entire aviation sector." Jordan froze. Amelia nearly lost her voice. "Chris, that is a position equivalent to a cabinet-level role." The grey-haired woman said, "You are the only person in 20 years who has done what all of us avoided, confront the truth." Chris looked at her hand. In a single flash, the memory of the incident in the Charlotte jetway returned like lightning. The gate agent's contempt, the supervisor's dismissal, the empty first-class seat with his name. His body squeezed between two strangers in economy, the humiliation, the fury, and the moment he decided, "No, I will not stay silent." He tightened his fist once. Then he reached out and took her hand. "Then we begin," Chris said. 3 months later, the entire country was buzzing with the transformation of the airline industry. No more seat allocation based on subjective judgment. No more random screenings focused on certain groups. No more evaluations like "this customer does not fit the cabin." No more invisible hands pushing passengers away from first class. On major airlines across the country, the LED panels read, fair flight active, bias-free monitoring, on transparency protocol on. Skywave was no longer the controversial airline. It had become the leader. On the first Skywave flight with the new system fully active, Chris Lawson boarded the aircraft. A young attendant with warm brown skin and neatly tied hair smiled sincerely, not the rehearsed kind. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Lawson," she said. "Your first-class seat is waiting." Chris smiled. "Thank you. But I'm not flying first class today." She blinked. "You chose economy." Chris shook his head. "I chose the seat the fairness system assigned me." He handed her the boarding pass. "Seat 3A, she read. She let out a soft laugh. "Looks like you're in first class anyway." Chris stepped into the cabin. No one stared at him with suspicion. No one judged. No one asked whether he could afford the seat. He sat down, looked out the aircraft window. The sky that day was impossibly blue. Not because of the weather, but because the sky at last belonged to everyone. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and power dynamics, the journey of Chris Lawson reveals a truth that has never changed. Injustice does not begin with grand actions. It begins with small habits, quietly accepted and repeated across generations. And a system only truly changes when someone courageous enough stands up and points directly at the rules everyone knows exist, but no one dares to confront. Chris was not fighting for a first-class seat. He was fighting for a principle: human dignity must never be measured by appearance, race, or bias. What makes his journey extraordinary is not that he challenged an airline, but that he dared to restructure the very foundation of how we are treated the moment we step into the sky. And the most important message this story leaves behind is simple technology can optimize a system, but ethics determine who that system serves. If Chris's journey inspires you, please like the video to help this message of equality reach even farther, and do not forget to subscribe to continue following the stories where ordinary people dare to change an entire structure. And before you go, comment the phrase "fly fair" to remind each other that every sky is only truly beautiful when all of us are treated the same.